What happens when a woman who had promised everything to keep a family roof intact finds a forbidden desire that answers with sounds she never expected to hear from herself? In a chapel of glass and marble, she walked forward like a soldier wearing silk, every step answering to a pact she had not chosen. The air smelled of wet stone and a floral perfume that never seemed to leave her skin, a scent that braided with the hush of voices and the scrape of shoes on cold floors. Cloe moved because her mother needed the house, because creditors had names and signatures, because her brother had bills with no mercy, not because her heart had chosen to stand beside the man waiting at the altar. Marcus Hale stood there like a ledger given flesh, coat immaculate, jaw practiced in control, eyes folding people into balances and numbers. He spoke once before vows, voice even like a boardroom, and the words landed like a clause. Someone said, "May you kiss the bride," and the world sharpened. Something inside Cloe cracked, not into surrender, but into an answering question. His hand found the small of her back, and she felt a current that had nothing to do with agreements. The kiss that followed was not a sealing of papers. It was an accusation, whispered between two wills. The room hit a strange silence, and then a rustle of scandal. If he thought he had bought an obedient symbol, he had misread the contract. If she had agreed to a union for survival, she would not be reduced to a file in his safe. This would be a war fought with touches and truths and the slow dismantling of armors. The chapel had been chosen for the way light fractured on marble, for the echo that made promises sound larger. Guests rearranged their expressions to look like support. Elena stood at the edge of the aisle, fingers white around a program, and muttered under her breath. Rosa held Henry by the elbow, his face a map of sleepless ledgers. Julian, who had been late because of a flat tire, arrived breathless and took his place with a look that asked if anything could be undone. Gabriel, the lawyer who drew the agreement, sat behind Marcus and smoothed his tie as if smoothing words into place. Everyone wore an idea about what marriage should look like. Cloe wore obligation. Marcus wore control. The officiant spoke the ritual lines, and the city outside continued indifferent. When Marcus breathed her name, it sounded like a verdict. Cloe let her hands rest on the bouquet and did not tremble visibly, but the perfume of gardenias and old paper lodged behind her sternum. She had promised. He had purchased peace. The audience expected a bow in return. After the pronouncement, under the polite clapping, voices started, some sharp, some curious. A small yet pointed movement at the back, where Sonia, a cousin, raised her eyebrows. Mrs. Alvarez whispered to Sophia, the family friend, with a tone that meant gossip will find corners to live in. Cloe and Marcus moved through the reception like two pieces placed on a board. Candles burned with the scent of lemon rind and wax. The marble floor reflected the chandeliers in little islands of gold. Marcus did not let her out of his sight. He introduced her as partner and ally with a clinical warmth that left no room for softness. He asked questions about the estate in the same sentence as he offered wine. Cloe answered with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed answers for months. Their dialogue that evening was a duel, masked as civility. They spoke in the hall by the entryway, voices careful. Marcus said, "We will proceed as agreed." Cloe answered, "We both know what the terms are." Marcus, "Good, then there will be no surprises." Cloe, "I am not a surprise to be managed." Marcus, "We will maintain appearances for the bank and the board." Cloe, "I will maintain my dignity." Marcus, "Dignity does not pay debts. Nor does calm indifference heal family." Marcus paused, as if discovering she had patience as a weapon. Then Marcus looked at her and asked, "Do you regret this?" Cloe, with a softness that was more dangerous than anger, said, "I regret more the idea that a signature can fix everything." Their words circled each other, edged with civility and something that smelled dangerously like interest. The mansion where Marcus took Cloe after the wedding was all marble and glass in a way that made warmth feel like an intrusion. The foyer smelled faintly of citrus polish. Service boots echoed. A butler named Thomas greeted them with a bow that was more emotion toward protocol than welcome. In the private study, Marcus handed over a folder with the agreements, clauses underlined, obligations spelled out in the measured language of lawyers. Cloe opened it and found neat paragraphs, contingencies, a clause about an exit option that read like a trapdoor. Gabriel, the lawyer, had circled signatures and left sticky notes. Cloe read silently, fingers tracing the printed words, the perfume of ink and paper a new leitmotif alongside marble and paint. She had always been the woman who read contracts to protect people, who stayed later at the firm when others had left. Her backstory was stitched into those nights. Cloe had grown up in a narrow house on the edge of the old quarter, where her mother Rosa taught seamstress skills, and her father Henry had once run a small gallery that folded under rising rents. At 17, she had left town for a scholarship to study restoration of paintings and carried with her a stubborn oath to keep the family from falling apart. She learned to read the age of varnish and the way light revealed truth, and in the quiet of studios, she promised herself she would not be the sort of woman who gave up before trying every way to fix what was fraying. Her hands had calluses from brushes and from long nights cataloging invoices. She had turned down offers that would have saved her, but cost her the document of who she was. She loved Elena with a ferocity that looked like softness because Elena had been reckless and needed rescue more times than Cloe could count. Julian had been her friend since university and had always believed her capable of small miracles. Cloe's childhood was full of paint, low loans, strong coffee, the smell of lemon soap, and old canvas. The drive to protect the house came from the day the landlord's notice arrived and the neighbors started whispering about auctions. She had signed the marriage agreement because she could not watch the roof go without trying everything. That decision was practical and painful, a ledger of costs and compromises. Yet in the ledger, there was room for miscalculation. Marcus had a past that read like polished paper on a desk. He had risen through conservative firms, a man taught to value numbers over nerves. He had been widowed once in an arrangement that left him with children to care for and a business to study. He kept photographs in a drawer wrapped in tissue, and on nights when his eyes were heavy with strategy, he had moments when he would stand in the study and listen to the quiet as if trying to translate it into policy. People called him implacable and efficient. As a child, he had learned that feelings compromised outcomes, that emotion was an expense to be minimized. His mentors had been men who wore silence as armor. He had made a vow to protect those under his charge by controlling variables. Yet there were soft cracks. He loved a son, Matteo, more than procedure. He sometimes paused at the nursery door when no one was looking. He had once almost forgiven a mistake that cost him money, and felt ashamed for the human impulse that had moved him. Marcus's vulnerability did not show in speeches or in contracts. It sat in small things, like the way he kept a box of pressed letters or a fountain pen that he refused to insure. His sternness had saved companies, but it had also taught him not to ask for rescue. When Cloe stepped into his life, he perceived at first a liability, and then something that made him reassess risk with a strange, clumsy care. The discovery in the mansion days after the wedding came by accident. Cloe had been in the study rearranging a stack of donated canvases when a photograph slipped from between pages and landed on the rug. It was of Marcus, younger, smiling with an unguarded light that did not belong in boardrooms. On the back, in handwriting, there was a name and a place that explained a tenderness he had never offered publicly. Cloe felt an opening, like a seam she could press and make whole. She began to notice small things. The faint smell of paint in his coat when he returned from meetings, the way his hands softened when he spoke of charity projects, how his laughter came out thin but true when he saw a child's drawing. She began to peel layers. In the kitchen, while the staff prepared dinner, she asked him a question that began another kind of negotiation. They were usually careful in public, But in the privacy of the East Garden, where a fountain kept time and jasmine twined along stone, their exchanges became tests. Marcus said, "You seem different than I expected." Cloe, "Different in what way?" Marcus, "Less willing to be quiet." Cloe, "Less willing to be treated as silence." Marcus, "That could be destabilizing." Cloe smiled, a small, dangerous thing, and said, "Or it could be clarifying." Marcus, "Clarifying how?" "Clarifying what we both really want." Marcus, "And what is that, exactly?" "To be more than our signatures." "That is dangerously vague. Vague enough to be honest." Their sentences skated on surfaces and then dropped into edges. The garden smelled of wet stone and paint from an easel that was kept by a sidewall. The leitmotifs circled like birds. A present came a week later. Marcus arranged for a studio to be set up on the mansion's top floor. Light poured from a skylight that had been shuttered for years. He watched as Cloe entered, with an apron tied and brushes in her pocket. He had chosen colors for her, bought canvases, and left a note that read, "For your hands." It should have been a gesture of control, but it landed as something else. Cloe stood in the middle of that room, paint dust catching on the light like small constellations. She felt a recognition that she had been chosen not to be hidden, but to be made visible. In their conversation that afternoon, they traded promises like experiments. Cloe asked, "Why did you do this?" Marcus replied, "Because you need space to work, and I have the means to provide it." Cloe, "Or because you wanted me to be where you could see me." "Perhaps I wanted that too." "Then be honest about it. Honesty could damage reputations, or it could build something new. You make bravery look easy. It never was easy. Then I will have to learn to be more than numbers." Cloe rested a hand against a painted canvas, the texture of oil warm under her palm, the aroma of linseed oil joining other smells as if to create a new perfume. There were moments of tension that escalated like storms, 3 that broke through the quiet and demanded reckoning. The first moment happened at a charity gala when a rival whispered an insinuation about the nature of their marriage. For 5 minutes, the room pulsed with speculation, and Marcus's jaw tightened. The exchange between them after they returned home was precise and brutal enough to change the rules. Marcus said, "Do you regret this?" Cloe answered, "I regret that others think they own my life." Marcus, "You could walk away and leave my family to be evicted?" Marcus, "There are other ways to survive. None that would keep my brother safe." Marcus, "Then we have bound ourselves to an arrangement, a living arrangement, not one that strips me of choice. Choice can mean chaos. Chaos can mean freedom." The conversation ended with silence, their breaths small against the marble, the perfume of coffee lingering. That evening, Cloe realized she had to make Marcus see her without the contract between them. A second moment unfolded when a painter named Ava came to the studio with an offer to curate an exhibit that would put Cloe's restorations on a public pedestal. Marcus feared the exposure for reasons that had more to do with control than protection. Ava pushed. Marcus pushed back. Cloe was in the middle and felt pulled like canvas on a stretch frame. Dialogue in the studio that afternoon stretched longer. Ava said, "Your work deserves more than private commissions." Cloe answered, "I appreciate that, but my priorities are different." Ava, "Priorities do not preclude recognition." Cloe, "Recognition was never the point. Saving the house was." Marcus, "Public attention brings unwanted scrutiny. Scrutiny is part of art." Cloe, "It could also mean allies." Marcus, "Allies can be costly in reputation." Ava, "Reputation can be rebuilt." Cloe, "If allies mean the house is saved and my work continues, I will accept them." Marcus, "Then we will need terms." Ava, "Terms of collaboration, and not of ownership." Marcus's face was closed, but something in his voice shifted toward concession. The studio smelled of turpentine and a sweetness that came from a cup left by the window. That exchange altered trajectories. It made Cloe understand that influence could be negotiated and not always conceded. The third major tension arrived with a secret revealed by Julian, her oldest friend, who had been digging into financial irregularities and found a clause Gabriel had overlooked. It suggested that Marcus's company had contingencies that could complicate their arrangement if certain thresholds were not met. The discovery put them in legal danger and forced Cloe to confront the contract's edges. In a late-night call, Julian said, "This clause could force you out." Cloe replied, "I know." Julian, "Then you have to be careful." Cloe, "I signed to protect people I love. And now? Now I need to protect myself, too. We will get help. I do not want to be helped like charity. Then we will fight this the way you like, with facts." Cloe, "With paint and paper and proof." The words kept the fight alive and made allies of those who had once been observers. The pressure bent Marcus toward transparency and forced him to reveal a part of himself that had been afraid of appearing weak. Intimacy between Marcus and Cloe did not bloom like a sudden flower. It was constructed in small rooms, in the studio where paint stained fingers, in late-night conversations by the fireplace, in touches that were careful and then less so. Their sexual connection, when it came, was framed in tenderness rather than explicit detail. They learned each other in fragments. Marcus learned the map of tension in Cloe's shoulders and how her breath changed when she was surprised by color. Cloe learned that Marcus's hands could be firm and protective and that his voice softened when he apologized. There was a night when rain tapped on the skylight and they lay side by side on the studio floor, canvases leaning like witnesses. Cloe said, "This feels forbidden." Marcus answered, "Forbidden things have their own truths." Cloe, "How do you know which truths to follow?" Marcus, "The ones that do not betray conscience." Cloe, "And what about desire?" Desire is not always wrong. Cloe, "Sometimes it is dangerous. So is indifference." They spoke in low sentences, touches brief and significant, a kiss long enough to become a language but never a catalog of acts. The sounds Cloe made were described as breath and small admitted moans, not salacious detail, and even when they gave in to passion, the narrative preserved intimacy without pornography. After that night, Marcus made a promise out loud. "I will learn to be less a ledger and more a partner." Cloe, with paint in her hair and sweat cooling on her temple, said, "Teach me how to trust numbers that hold warmth." Word spread in a way that made the mansion feel watched. Sonia commented at a luncheon. Mrs. Alvarez fanned herself and invited neighbors to look. Mateo, Marcus's son, observed them with the unfiltered honesty of a child and asked Cloe once, "Do you like my dad?" Cloe crouched and said, "I am learning to." Mateo said, "You make him smile different." Cloe fought the urge to say, "Thank you," and instead simply stroked his hair. Thomas the butler adjusted the dining settings with extra care and often saw them exchange furtive glances across a room. The household staff included Sophia, the housekeeper, who brought tea and always placed family photographs where eyes were likely to rest. Each named person reacted and contributed to the fabric of their life. The presence of community mattered. It created stakes and witnesses. As time moved, a test arrived in the form of a medical exam that Cloe undertook quietly. The procedural description was precise and credible. She sat in a small clinic smelling of antiseptic and lemon and signed a consent form with a hand that trembled. The nurse explained processes. "We will take blood, we will do an ultrasound if necessary, we will compare results against the baseline." The paperwork included options and recommended follow-ups. Cloe listened, asked to be informed of every step, and received a printout that would later change the rhythm of their lives. The technical words were simple and clear and gave the scene a realistic grounding. When the results came, they shifted their world. It was a discovery that forced a reconfiguration of priorities. In the quiet of the study, Cloe held the small card and read the lines as if reading a contract that had been written in a different ink. She felt vertigo. Marcus came in and read it over her shoulder. His expression broke into something like uncalculated fear. Marcus asked, "Is this true?" Cloe answered, "It is." Marcus, "How do you feel about this?" Cloe, "I feel surprised." Marcus, "And the house?" "That worry is still there." "Then we will keep both." Cloe, Can a man who runs on control see the world change in him? Marcus, I will try. The promise that followed was not a formal clause, but a vow. We will be guardians. He put his hand over hers, and the marble beneath their feet felt less like an accusation. The life that followed found rhythms. They moved from nights of protocol to mornings where Cloe painted and Marcus brewed coffee the way his mother had once taught him. They arranged for a bed for Mateo and found ways to share the small celebrations of a household, learning the language of compromise. Cloe taught Marcus how to stretch a canvas, and he watched with the fascination of someone learning to observe rather than direct. The leitmotifs repeated: the perfume she wore during exhibitions, the marble entry that now held laughter, the smell of paint that seeped into corridors. They navigated gossip, balanced budgets with Gabriel, and leaned on Julian for research when clauses needed interpretation. Friends like Ava and Sophia came to the studio and offered honest critique and strong opinions. Elena, who had once begged Cloe to be less careful, now admired the way she held a new life. There were moments of tenderness that defined transformation rather than triumph. Marcus, once implacable, attended a small clinic appointment and sat beside the exam room with a hand over Cloe's and a face that had been weathered but now softened. He learned to ask questions without making them assessments. Cloe learned to admit fear and to ask for help. Each apology between them was a small revolution in character. Julian would often drop by bearing coffee and research and say, "You both look tired," in a good way, as if exhaustion could be polished into contentment. Before the final reckoning, a call to the viewers matched the story's pulse, asking for reflection and engagement. If you were in that chapel right now, what would you do when you saw that first kiss? Do you think duty can coexist with desire? Leave a comment starting with "I would stay if" or "I would leave if," and tell us why. The community's responses will shape which challenges we tell next and the most. Thoughtful comments may be featured in future videos. Your voice matters in the conversation about choices and consequences. Now back to the story. The night that folded them into a new reality came like a slow unraveling of defenses. They had walked through storms and through art openings and sat through long legal meetings in which Gabriel argued clauses with an almost paternal insistence. Marcus had been learning to admit missteps. Cloe had been learning to ask for herself. The climax of their transformation was not a single fiery scene, but a night of mutual confession in the studio under the skylight, where paint dried in pale rivers. They spoke at length. Marcus said, "I used to believe that keeping control was the only way to keep people safe." Cloe answered, "Control can feel like safety, but it can also be a cage." Marcus, "You taught me that." Cloe, "You taught me that strength can include softness." Marcus, "I was afraid softness would lead to being hurt." Cloe, "Being hurt does not mean you were wrong to try." Marcus, "And desire? Desire is honest when it is shared, and not used as a weapon. Then I will try to be honest." Cloe, "And I will try to trust." The exchange was long and full of small pauses where their breaths were the punctuation. They moved closer until hands met and words thinned into touch. The scene that followed honored intimacy without explicit catalogs. Their connection was described as warmth, as a melding of breath and sigh, as whispers that turned into admitted moans, the narration named as small sounds of release and relief rather than explicit depiction. After, they lay with paint on their skin and the skylight above catching the first pale stars. Marcus whispered, "I did not know it would feel like this." Cloe said, "Neither did I." Marcus, "Do you regret your choice?" "I regret only that it took this long for us to speak without contracts between us." He kissed the inside of her wrist and promised, "I will choose you every morning." The months that followed reorganized life. The pregnancy, once an announcement that could have destabilized them, became a shared project. They repainted a nursery together, choosing colors with passion and deliberation. Gabriel helped them adjust the agreement into a partnership that allowed autonomy and protected the house. Matteo learned to help with little tasks and grow into the role of a son with more patience than he had shown before. Community voices softened as the mystery of a marriage that had surprised them became a narrative of two people growing into each other. An epilogue presented their lives in 3 moments that tracked the arc from tentative to settled. 1 month later, they hosted a small gathering where the house smelled of lemon and basil, the marble now warmed with laughter. Friends like Ava brought small cacti in quirky pots. Julian came with a portfolio of articles highlighting Cloe's restorations. Elena cried in a corner and then laughed with relief. Marcus moved through the rooms with an ease that surprised him, and his staff noticed that he took a moment to ask how Cloe's day had been. The invitation list was a blend of family and new friends, a community of witnesses that included Sophia, Thomas, and Gabriel. They toasted with simple glasses and spoke of future projects. It felt like a new cadence. 3 months after they renewed daily habits into routines, Cloe had her first public exhibit where Marcus stood in the front row not as a guardian but as a supporter. The paintings were hung under lights that made the oils breathe, and the audience leaned in, whispering at brushstrokes that told stories of restoration and of layered lives. The event was a turning point where reputation and art fused, and where Marcus allowed applause to reach his eyes. Matteo clapped the loudest, as if practice had taught him the art of being present. Financial arrangements had been steadied, and Gabriel had renegotiated terms that left autonomy intact. Conversations that once aimed to protect an estate now often turned to the possibility of a foundation for apprentices, a project that merged Marcus's stewardship with Cloe's hands. They began to talk publicly about collaboration, and to plan a small workshop where neighbors could learn to restore old frames, and in doing so preserve tales of a town that had once feared losing its past. 6 months later, they renewed their vows in a tiny ceremony in the studio, not because people required it, but because they wanted to articulate the promises they had chosen on their own. The skylight was opened and stars lingered like witnesses. Friends and family attended, seats arranged around canvases. Marcus read a short note about learning to be less a ruler of ledger and more a keeper of heart. Cloe spoke about choosing daily and about how a contract could never have taught her the architecture of trust. They named those who had been with them. Elena, who had waved calm into chaos, Julian, who had reminded them to contest injustice, Gabriel, who had turned legalese into protection, Ava, who had curated their art into the world, Thomas and Sophia, who managed the household with devotion, Matteo, who had learned to forgive grown-up mistakes, and Rosa and Henry, whose sacrifices had been the first scaffolding in their lives. After the ceremony, they walked through rooms that smelled of paint and lemon and communal meals, and they found themselves laughing with a freedom that had nothing to do with bargains and everything to do with choice. The conclusion of their story was not a fairy tale, but a careful construction of life. The house that had been at risk now held canvases and children, and the steady rhythm of breakfasts that included paint flecks. The partnership that began as a practical arrangement became a shared project of repair and tenderness. Cloe had not surrendered her soul to a contract. Instead, she had used the contract as a bridge to get to a place where she could insist on being seen. Marcus had not stopped being complex. He had learned that control could be traded for connection without catastrophe. They did not find an easy ending, but they built a groundwork where choice repeated itself each day. Cloe once whispered, "I choose this life with you," and Marcus answered, "I choose you every morning." If this journey moved you, and you want to see more stories where duty and desire collide, and where characters rebuild rather than resign, please subscribe and join our community. Share your thoughts below, and tell us which moment you would have handled differently. Your voice helps shape what comes next, and keeps the conversation about choice and transformation alive.